Everyone. Bob Surridge, President of Southport Historical Society, and I'm really looking forward to today's second Tuesday talk. Desiree Bridge is going to talk to us about Christmas dinner during World War II and mentioning some of the challenges that rationing during the war caused folks with their Christmas dinner meal. Desiree, would you like to begin?
Sure. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining me today. I'm sure you're all aware that it's kind of ironic we're doing the talk today about rationing during World War II, because yesterday, December 7th, was the 79th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which today, December 8th, we declared war on the Japanese Empire. And then we see rationing coming in the following spring. Now, this is modern history, so a lot of you probably know someone, whether it's a colleague, a friend, a family member, or yourself, who can remember World War II or rationing. As I'm talking, I'll be throwing in stories of family members and friends that I know of what they went through during that time. And at the end, I actually have 3 recipes we'll be putting up and going over. And then after that, I'll open it up to questions. If you don't have any questions, that's fine. But if this is bringing forth any memories or stories you would like to share at the end, please feel free, excuse me, to share some of the stories that you might have of World War II rationing and how it might have affected folks that you knew. I am a member of the board of the Southport Historical Society, if none of you have met me, and I'm basically a cultural historian, and I focus mainly on the cuisine and baking techniques of the past. I also like to look at medical lore, what you would have been using in your households. And if any of you had joined me for a talk I've done a couple months ago, where I was talking about herbs and how they would have been used in the home, especially for medical purposes, there was one plant I kind of waxed poetic about, and it's actually going to come back into this talk today. I love this plant so much. I'm so excited about it. I will be honest, this talk actually does better when we're in person. Most of my talks do, because I bring things for you to kind of touch and taste and smell. So maybe in the future, we'll be able to kind of come back to this, and I will be able to create some of these recipes. And as we're discussing and talking about them, you'll be able to try them yourself. The recipes that will be available at the end of the talk are pretty simple. I did that so that you could either write it down while I went over it, or if you don't want to write it down, you can just send us your info and we can email it to you. Especially during this time that we're going through right now, where we're not exactly rationing, but we're finding certain items hard to come by, we can kind of relate, I think, a little more to the folks of the past than perhaps we could have, let's say, 2-3 years ago, when you needed something, you can't find it in one grocery store, you just drove across the street to another grocery store and they usually had it there. Keep in mind, the generations that lived through World War II had already had a pretty rough start. Rationing to them was not new. It wasn't welcomed, but when they did a survey, about 89% of Americans were okay with rationing. In fact, they preferred rationing to the thought of going without or seeing a lack of food items being available. You have rationing with World War I, so that's 1914 to 1918. Then you have your Depression of 1920 to 21. You have the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939. And then, of course, we've got World War II. 1939 for the world, for us, not so much 39, but 1939 to 1945. And for me, my great grandfather, who was born in 1901, he lived through all of that by the time he got to World War II. Victory gardens have become very trendy this past year. Victory gardens were big in World War II, but again, if you go back to World War I, you see people using those as a means to supplement food in their homes that they couldn't get. You go back to any time of war, and you will see people kind of pulling in and trying to go with local resources. Now, one thing that we'll see happening with rationing during World War II in a long-term effect is you may see people's diets changing. Some who had to do without, let's use sugar as our prime example, because that's going to be the first thing rationed and the last thing that isn't rationed. You'll either have folks that don't really foresee their future needing sugar. So my great-grandfather stopped using it in his sugar, never used it again. He actually preferred the taste of coffee without sugar in it. And if he ate sweet treats, they weren't as sweet as what we would like today. I have other family members, though, that the minute sugar came back in demand and could meet supply or met demand through supply, they just had the biggest sweet tooth. They could not go a minute without having sugar in their diet. We're going to see things coming into mainstream and become more readily available and actually part of our culture. For instance, corn syrup is used as an alternative for sugar in the households. It's not a new product in World War II. It actually was invented back in 1812, but it kind of gets its foothold in America during the war and stays on. Keep in mind there is a difference between corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup comes much later in the 1950s. Saccharin is also an alternative that you can use to sugar, and we do see people using. That goes way back to 1879. So sometimes we tend to look at these ingredients in our pantry today and assume they all came about in the 60s and the 70s, but they actually have a much longer history. Now, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, we see Americans starting to ration April 27th, 1942. First ration books start coming out May 1942, and that's book one. And book one also is often called the sugar book. Sugar was still out there. It's just trade routes were being interrupted by the war. It could be cargo ships that were going to be bringing sugar in from Hawaii or the Philippines are being used for the war effort, or you can see German U-boats basically targeting these vessels, and that is also going to cause an issue with getting that item into the United States. You could still see people using sugar. Often it was rationed to you were able to get 8 ounces of sugar to use at home. We may say, oh, well, that's quite a bit of sugar. But then if you think about the holidays and how much sugar we use today in our cooking and our baking, 8 ounces is not a lot of sugar. So you can see them either, again, using the corn syrup or the saccharin as a substitute. Oftentimes what we see folks doing is supplementing with fruits like raisins. Fruitcake is very popular during this time. War cakes are also very popular. And when you look at the recipes, the sugar content is minute compared to today's standards. Not only by pulling back on that sugar are you not going to have as sweet a final product, but it is going to change the texture a bit. So a lot of your desserts that you might have been having at Christmas time could sometimes be a bit denser and a bit heavier than what we would particularly care for today. Rationing was a pretty stringent and very strict code to go by. You would be given, I'm sorry, it's a little cutout picture, but you would be given like a little ration book. There was a code that went with it. You were, for instance, when a person dies, his war book ration must be returned to the local ration board in accordance with regulations. So you couldn't just pass it on to another family member. If you entered a hospital or other institution and were expected to be there more than 10 days, you must turn your ration book over to a person in charge, and then it would be returned to you upon your request when you leave. Children, if they had ration books, parents, you were in charge of them. You had to make sure they were using them properly. Rationing for, let's say, a child under 6 could be they only get 3/4 of a pound of meat allotted to them for that week. When it comes to your ration books itself, I'll have people ask, well, could they go on the black market or get things illegally? You could, and it did happen, but there is across this country between 5,000 and 8,000 ration boards that are kind of keeping an eye on things. And you have people within your community that are also kind of watching what you're doing. So you had to be very careful if you started going and trying the black market or seeing if you could kind of cheat the system a bit. The people that I talked to when they reminisce from this time period, most of them said it really wasn't worth it. And if they were going to go that route, it wasn't going to be really until they started seeing whiskey coming off the market. And that was more or less the moonshine is kind of something that they might have been interested in. Now I talk about sugar, but another very, very important American object that is rationed pretty early on by the war is coffee. We take it for granted today that you can go to a grocery store and there's like a wall of different types of coffee beans that we can pick from, whether we want them whole or ground. But that is another cargo ship that was targeted by U-boats pretty early on in the start of the war. And your coffee was coming up from South America during this time period. Also, what you're going to see with sugar and coffee with a lot of folks is they're going to take what they got in their ration supply. And if they had a loved one fighting over in the war, they were going to send it over to them to make their life easier and kind of remind them that they still had support back here in the country. So if, let's say, you got your ration of coffee and you wanted to send some to your son, your brother, your uncle, whoever was fighting over in the Pacific or in Europe, you could maybe bump up the flavor a bit by using chicory. You can still find chicory coffee in the grocery store. Most of the time when you talk to folks, they think it's just something that's popular down in Louisiana. But chicory coffee goes way back in American history and cookbooks and such like that. It is a root. It is part of the dandelion family. And if you've never had it, try it. It's almost like a kind of a robust tea version of coffee. Another thing you can see if someone says, well, I don't want any of my coffee at all supplies, I'm going to send it off to someone that needs it, is the humble dandelion that is growing out in your garden. And this is the plant that I absolutely adore. Now, the dandelion I'm talking about is not the Native American dandelion. This is the dandelion that was brought over from Europe and is naturalized in our soil and is everywhere in our yard. Up north, you're more likely to see the red seed dandelion, or down here, the common dandelion, which is everywhere. This was actually a pretty great plant to have if you're ever going through a time of rationing or even just a time of lack of being able to get coffee, sweetener, and salad greens. You can soak dandelion flowers in your corn syrup, and it will end up having almost a floral honey flavor when you were done, so you could use that as a sweet substitute. If you were not the best gardener, or let's say you're having issues with rabbits in your victory garden when it comes to lettuce, you can actually harvest young leaves from the dandelion and eat that. And then the roots themselves, you can kind of dry them out, roast them up a little, and then make almost a tea out of it, which again, like the chicory, is going to have a coffee-like flavor to it. So I highly recommend this spring, if you start grabbing that weed killer and you go out in your yard after that poor little dandelion, I really recommend you let this one live. It is a great, great plant, and I really feel like it just never gets the recognition that it needs throughout history and how it can come to your need when needed. Now, if you were to just keep the coffee for yourself, let's say you don't have anyone fighting over there and you just really need it, you're going to be getting about 1 pound of coffee to last 5 weeks. So you're not going to be drinking multiple cups of coffee throughout the day like we're used to today. And because of that, and one of the most important things for a lot of folks, I think, and Folgers makes a pretty good commercial every Christmas about this, is you think Christmas morning, as everyone's waking up, you've got the pot of coffee going, you can smell it, it wakes folks up, they come staggering out to eat their breakfast, look at presents. If you weren't going to be doing any of the other alternatives I talked about, we see herbal teas becoming more popular in certain households. Not all, but in certain households. So instead of making a pot of chicory or dandelion or coffee itself, you might see people brewing up some bee balm, which is kind of like your Earl Grey flavored teas. You might be seeing them doing lavender teas. I even have talked to folks that were not that great at growing vegetables, but they were able to grow all kinds of herbs in their garden. So they would just kind of, do a trade with a neighbor. I may not be able to produce carrots. You have them in abundance. How about I give you some of these herbs, which you can use for teas and flavoring, and I'll take some of your carrots. And one woman said she remembers her family around the holidays brewing up sage tea and then putting a little bit of corn syrup in it. And she fell in love with the flavor. Later on in life, she switched from corn syrup to honey. She says her sister to this day cannot stand the smell or sight of sage because her sister was 10 years old and really did not want a warm cup of corn syrup sage tea. It just wasn't something she enjoyed. Another ingredient that is used quite heavily in Christmas cuisine when it comes to baking is eggs. We don't really see in America eggs being quite an issue as you do, let's say, in Britain. In America, you see people being encouraged to keep chickens for their meat and for their eggs. And you will often see folks talk about, even in cities, finding some little small area that they can put their chicken just so that they are able to get their eggs that they need. If you weren't able to get your hands on fresh eggs, you could use reconcentrated or dry egg. I've not been able to get my hands on any. I've kind of wanted to try it just to see what it tastes like, because anyone that I've known who's eaten reconstituted egg has such an abhorrence to it that it must not be like what we think of egg beaters and such like that. I knew a woman whose mother actually lived during the London Blitz. She was 12 years old. And towards the end of the war, her family, even with rationing, they just were not able to get their hands on fresh meat. and they were surviving solely on reconstituted eggs. And pretty much almost every day for dinner, they were eating eggs in a basket or eggs in a nest. And that's where you're going to take your bread, cut the center out, put it in your skillet with some butter, oil, whatever you had to fry it up. Probably didn't have butter if they're living through the Blitz. Crack an egg in the center and then basically fry it up. So it's almost like a fried egg within your toast. Well, they're using the reconstituted eggs. She said it was horrible. The bread they were using was your most basic of bread. And she said her mother was not a great baker. So it wasn't, even though it was what we would call a basic sourdough, she said her mother just never learned how to make bread properly. It was real thick. It was hard as a rock when it came out. She said, I remember chipping my teeth on it as I'm eating it. And, you know, she goes, to this day, her mother would never eat an egg that had been fried, boiled, scrambled. She would eat it in things. She would make it for her family. But if you approached her with an egg on a plate, she would just be like, no, and stand up and walk away, because all it did was remind her of that horrible, horrible year where they lived off of just a not great egg product itself. When it comes to meats, we do see a lot of our meats being sent over to the troops. In fact, anything that could be preserved and shipped is going to be going over to the troops or anyone else that was serving during this time period. I have seen, I should say, a couple menus that were printed, and, you know, this is what you would have been eating around, let's say, Thanksgiving or Christmas if you were serving. You would have a tom turkey, olives, nuts, coffee, candied yams and carrots, and if you were very lucky, some cigarettes would have been given to you also if you were serving. Now, of course, it's going to be easier to get this food to the troops that maybe are not out in the trenches or on the very front of fighting, but it looks like we were trying our darndest to make sure that our people fighting, serving, were getting as many comfort meals as possible to basically keep them going, both mentally and emotionally. Later on, when it becomes harder to get these food items to certain troops, soldiers coming back would often say they were happy if all they got was an orange and a cup of coffee, or more importantly, a hot beer. They didn't even care if it was a cold beer. They just wanted a beer and an orange. And to us today, that might seem strange, not so much the beer, but the orange, but oranges were typically only really seen around the winter time. It was a seasonal crop. It was historically often a Christmas gift, especially if you go back to Edwardian and Victorian ages. Some of you today may still remember getting an orange at Christmas time, whether it was in your stocking, yes, or off to the side. And as a child, you may have been like, an orange, but it had a very important past, especially when you didn't have oranges coming to you in abundance like we do today. It's a good source of vitamin C. It's extremely sweet. So again, if you're going without sugar, at this point in time, it's going to be a welcome treat. And later on, you even see them, once sugar comes back in, making those peppermint straws so you can stick it into your orange and then drink it up that way. A lot of people told me, they were like, if I had that when I was fighting in World War II, I could have just gone another distance because I would have been high on that orange juice and that sugar coming out of that candy cane. Meat-wise, for people on the home front, you can see some interesting things going on. One of the things that is popular is mock everything. So it might be mock turkey, mock ham. I even have a recipe which we'll be going over for mock brains, because evidently, I'm sorry, maybe it's just me. Brains are, there are people that just craved brains during the rationing and the issues with World War II. I think it's just me. I'm not a fan of it. When you're talking about mock meat, there might be a small amount of meat or protein in the actual recipe. It could be sausage meat. In some households, it might be 100% lentil and beans. If you look at a lot of these recipes, they would actually be quite welcomed in a vegetarian or even a vegan household today. In fact, oftentimes, if you look at modern recipes for your vegetarian meats where they're not calling for tofu, you can find the origins of these recipes during times of want, whether it's rationing or war. You're going to mix it with a lot of breadcrumbs. Bread was easy to come by in a sense. We were not sending our farmers that worked with grains over to fight. We needed them here to produce. I was telling Bob and Liz earlier, when you go to DC and look at the World War II memorial, you'll see actually a relief that shows wheat farmers, a tractor and a soldier leaning against the wheel, watching them, because he knew they were doing a good job. They were doing what was needed, producing grains for the American people and for the people that were fighting in the war. Carrots seem to be one of the easiest things for people to be growing in their victory gardens and everywhere. Carrots do have a pretty good shelf life, but almost every recipe I come across has carrots in it. Now, carrots are naturally sweet. They're just like beets. So if you had a sweet tooth and you're craving something, you're going to want that in your garden or in your cuisine to just kind of give you that sweet comfort that you may not be getting because you have already gone through, let's say, what you were rationed or even what you might have been using in place. Onions are another thing that you see being used quite heavily in a lot of these recipes. Celery. You do see milk come and go. Later on, it's mainly going to be powdered milk. That's going to be reconstituted with water. But a lot of the recipes will start out with milk. And then as you progress into the war by 44, 45, and even 46, some recipes are still going to say use water instead. Keep in mind, even though the war stops, we're going to say 1945, because supply could not meet demand. A lot of things are going to take a while before they become back into your home as a normal thing that you're going to have on a regular basis. If you were going to do yourself a Christmas meal, so you could do your mock turkey, you could do a carrot cake, or a carrot pudding, a fruit cake. You are going to eat a lot of vegetables on the side. The Victory Gardens, I mentioned earlier, the fact that folks even in the city had chickens and eggs. Well, they're growing things wherever they can. So we actually see with the diet during this time period, a healthy bump up of vegetables. We see a decrease of course, your sugars, your fats. Cooking oil is even becoming difficult at certain stages. So it's a leaner time. When you come out of this, you are going to, if you've ever had someone's clothing from World War II and looked at it, you're going to be like, my goodness, these were very small, petite people, because most folks are eating a very lean and green diet, pretty much what we kind of promote today. If you're way out in the country and you don't particularly care what type of meat you're eating, there have been instances of raccoon recipes popping up, possum, squirrel, other types of wild game. But if you're hungry and you want meat and you want to have a feast, whether it's Christmas, Thanksgiving, or birthday, that possum in your backyard is suddenly going to start to look pretty good. So meats that we typically don't think of eating today, and you never know. And I have met someone that ate possum and raccoon. They lived in the mountains in North Carolina, and it was not due to World War II. It was just that's what their family liked. they said it's really good meat if you know how to cook it properly. That person also brought in, I hate to say this because I love them in my backyard, a squirrel casserole, and I tried it. It was actually pretty tasty. So if it had a lot of onions and carrots and celery and seasoning in it. But again, if the meat's available, you're going to find people eating it. Casseroles are very popular also. So if you have a family that's not too keen on making a mock turkey or a ham, then you could see a casserole, which again is going to be a little bit of protein in the sense of animal meat, and then a lot of lentils and beans and other items are going to be put into it. You do see pre-made items becoming quite popular, preserved items. Spam, of course, is going to be big over with our troops. It's going to be big here in the States. Kraft Mac and Cheese, they basically said a good American will eat mac and cheese of this form. They're selling about 50 million boxes during this time period. Nabisco and Post and a couple other companies are putting out unique recipes of how to make cakes by soaking, let's say, their crackers and other items in corn syrup and then adding fruit to it to make a sweet treat or dessert. You can still find those recipes on the web. In fact, the great thing about looking into this, if you're interested, is just type into Google Christmas recipes, ration, World War II, and you're just going to find that people have uploaded all these glorious cookbooks from these time periods. But I've also seen or talked to people, and this is more in the rural area, and I'm basing this on the Piedmont Triad in North Carolina, so over in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, who had passed down through the family old cookbooks from your 17 and early 1800s, like the Frugal Housewife and such like that. They kind of took those cookbooks out during this time period, dusted them off, and said, okay, our forefathers survived without grocery stores and getting things out of season. How can we? And they said they actually started using these older cookbooks to basically supplement meals that they couldn't make traditionally. For instance, they're like, I love candied yams, but I was not going to make candied yams due to my sugar being sent over to my uncle. So they recommended in this recipe that I find honey and I use honey in it. It's fascinating to see that even today, with when we were not able to get things as readily available as we're used to, we're a pretty resourceful group of people. And it's fascinating to see throughout history, if something is lacking, then we're just going to figure out how we can get due and find something either to replace it or just come up with a new way of making a family tradition. Now, I've pretty much just looked at what time it was, realized if I'm going to show you these recipes, I should probably pull them up now and go over them. And the recipes I have are just 3. Do you mind putting them up, Liz? And again, if you don't want to write them down, feel free to get in touch with us. All right, so there's those mock brains I was talking about. So it's any leftover porridge you had. Today you could use oatmeal, self-rising flour, minced onion, a beaten egg, seasoning, salt and pepper. As far as frying it up or browning it, it would have been whatever form of cooking oil or fat you had on hand. I recommend, if you try this today, butter. It's kind of bland. Increase the salt and seasoning. You're going to want to make sure your porridge is not too dry and not too cold. Room temp, slightly wet, and it will give you I've not had brains. I asked someone what they said, and they said it gives you that wonderful texture. They said it's a delectable, creamy texture of brains. And I have to admit, whenever I look at this recipe, and I was laughing at a woman that found it, she said she kept going to Hannibal Lecter and Silence of the Lambs. And I have to admit, when I see this recipe, I can't help it just thinking that. But again, if you like brains, but you want a vegetarian version of it, I recommend trying this one. And they're going to be like a patty, or you could even roll them up and brown them up like you would a meatball. And one person that I know that is a vegetarian says they enjoy this as an alternative. She tried it at home and she said it was pretty decent. So I highly recommend giving this one a go just to see what would happen. Maybe slather some cream sauce or a marinara on top of it. All right, ready for the next recipe. All right, so the next one is wartime carrot cake. And I mentioned earlier, people are growing, seems to be a lot of carrots during this time period. It does call for margarine or cooking fat. You're probably more likely going to see folks using margarine at a later date. 2 cups of self-rising flour, half a cup of sugar. So you're going to have to be careful. That's about half your rationings right there. So this would have been for Christmas or a birthday or a special occasion. If you've got to pull back on the sugar, you of course could use saccharin, the corn syrup, or you could increase your carrot and raisins in this recipe if you did not want to use back then your half a cup or 4 ounces of sugar. It then calls for a 1/4 cup to a half a cup of water or milk, more likely water. And the reason there's that oddness in the amount is because it's left up to you. It's one of these you're slowly pouring in your liquid until you get to the right consistency. It then calls for either that 1 reconstituted dry egg or 1 fresh egg. Your oven's going to be at 355. You're going to use margarine or cooking fat or whatever you had to grease a pan and then line it with a piece of greased parchment. And that's important. If you don't grease this pan, it may not come out all that easily. You're going to rub in your fat into the flour. You want it to have a coarse feel to it. Almost think of making, if you've ever made like a short crust dough at home. You then add in your sugar, carrots, and your raisins. Mix well in the center, or make a well, excuse me, in the center, and then drop in your eggs and liquid to just kind of incorporate it in. And then you're just going to put this into the pan, bake it for 45 minutes, and then remove it from the oven and let it cool down for about 10 minutes. Now, I've actually tried this, and it's not that bad. It kind of reminds me of your pan form of Irish soda bread. It was dense, it was delicately sweet, and I would actually kind of like to play with this in the future and maybe add some lavender and maybe some rum to it, just to kind of play with the flavors and such. But this one, I was really pleasantly surprised when I baked this one up. I did like it. And then our next recipe we have.
Desi, I have a question. I'm not familiar with the term rub in the margarine.
Okay.
What does that mean?
So you're going to take your flour and then you're going to dice up your fat, or let's say you're using a cooking oil, whatever, drizzle it in, and then you're using your fingers to just work the fat and the flour together. And for this one, you want it to basically, you can kind of clump it together. It's not quite going to have a wet sand feel to it, but it is going to kind of start sticking together. It's going to have some form to it before you add your liquid to it. So it's different than if you, let's say, cream the liquid, the eggs, and the butter, and then add it your dry in, sort of like we do for cookies. It's not going to be as fine as when sometimes they'll say you're looking for little pea shapes, but basically just rub it in. I like sitting down in front of the TV or just kind of staring off into space and just thinking. And you just do it. It's actually really relaxing to mix a fat into flour. I don't know what it is. It kind of reminds you of when you were a kid playing in a sandbox or something like that. But it's something you don't have to think too hard on. So if you're worried about that stage, it's okay. It will all come together when you mix it at the end.
Okay. Let me get you your last recipe. There you go.
All right, and our last one is rhubarb jam without sugar. I forgot to mention this humble little item earlier, dates. I love dates. I think they are a wonderful thing, and I can eat them all the time. And this is just a side story, but my love of dates goes back to the first Indiana Jones movie, because when I was little, I loved Indiana Jones. And there's quite a few scenes in that movie where they're talking about dates. And I thought they were amazing looking. If Indiana Jones likes them, I should like them. And luckily I did. They're sweet. They have a long shelf life. And historically, they were a common occurrence in a lot of baked goods, especially for the holidays. You could use any type of fresh fruit that you want. You don't have to use rhubarb if you're not a fan of it. But to every pound of fruit, you're going to do half a pound of dates. You could get the dates and pit them yourself to get rid of the stone, but I really recommend just going ahead and getting pitted dates. And you can also buy them today chopped up in the bag so that they're sticky. It's not rough to chop up, but this will just kind of save you some time. But wash your fruit or rhubarb, chop it and put it in the preserving pan and heat slowly, or a saucepan. And you're stirring it to basically draw out the juice. Once you add the dates to it, you're going to want to simmer it for about 45 minutes. And then if you do canning, you're then going to put it in your hot, dry jars, try parchment covers on top. If you don't can, that's fine. Just go ahead and put this in a clean container, but then put it in your refrigerator and realize that it's not going to have as long a shelf life than if you put it into a preserving container. And for something like this, I would actually, if you put it in a preserving container, I would recommend probably eating it within a week or two. I haven't tried this recipe with rhubarb. I actually came across this recipe in a very similar form from the Civil War era, from an 1863 recipe. And I used apples with that one. So it's not quite an apple butter. The texture is going to be different because you're not really getting the pectin and the gelatin and such into it. But it worked. The dates did not really leave too much of a different flavor. We got the flavor of the apple itself, and we were using an heirloom breed when we experimented with it. So this was a drier apple than we're used to. So it did take a little longer to get the juice out of it, because your older breeds of fruit, typically like your apples, had a longer shelf life because they were a drier fruit. But try this one out at home. I have a friend that tried this with, what did she use? It wasn't cranberries, blackberries that she had harvested, and she really liked the end results. Now, she strained out, or basically pulled out, her dates towards the end because she didn't want it in it, but she said the same thing. It lasted about 2 weeks, and not quite the jelly we're used to today, but it was still very good. And she said she felt like you noticed the flavor of the blackberry a lot better. There wasn't that overly sweet flavor that we get today. I think a lot of jellies, it's almost like we want sugar that has a fruit flavor. We're not actually eating the fruit itself. And she said the dates did a good job of kind of bringing that tartness of those blackberries down just a little bit to where you weren't puckering up when you were eating it. So I could just keep going forever, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I notice we're getting towards the tail end. Does anybody have any questions or any stories that they want to share about what they may have had for a family member might have done during rationing or World War II?
Desiree, a couple things come to my mind. And actually, the first, now we have a new call. That's Save the Dandelion.
Yes. I think it should be made into a t-shirt.
So now we have a mission. All right.
Yes. It's a wonderful plant. I don't understand why no one wants to love it like I do.
I actually, as you're going on, remembering things that were, from my grandmother and her house, and she made rhubarb, and I'm sure a lot of people do, a rhubarb sauce, like an apple sauce. But it's a rhubarb sauce, and she had the nastiest rhubarb in town. I mean, it's just, I'll pucker her up. But still today, when I see a rhubarb strawberry pie, I think it's a waste of the rhubarb. So I learned well.
Yeah.
The other thing, immediately I started thinking, maybe rationing, or not maybe, rationing would be the solution to obesity in the United States.
I don't know how well it would go down today. I mean, again, when they did the survey, 89% of Americans were okay with rationing. I'm not sure if we did that.
You're not sure that's going to happen today?
No, I mean, not since high fructose corn syrup came about in 1957. I think we're having a hard enough time working that out of our system.
So, and mock apple pie with Ritz crackers.
Yes, that was a popular one. It's fascinating because they're not in reprint. They've never kind of really went out of print, but I just liked going through things that my grandmother had, which were like 1940s and 50s cookbooks. And you look at these cookbooks and they'll have what we would consider everyday recipes in there, let's say German chocolate cake, but then under it would be like a mock pie or a mock this. And even back in colonial days, you see mock recipe like mock turtle soup, and it could be, there's just some emotional attachment to that recipe. You can't come by the ingredients, so you're going to replicate it as best as possible, so you're still being able to feel like you're with that person or even that place. Prime example for me is there's a certain type of tea I like to drink that comes from Yorkshire, England, because it reminds me of when I did my study abroad there and I had a great time. So and especially if I drink it in the fall, I drink that tea and it just brings back all those happy, warm, fuzzy memories of when I was over there for a fall semester.
Mm-hmm. The other memory I have, I'm sure a lot of people do, is, and you mentioned this, that you got an orange in your stocking. We actually got tangerines in our stocking, as well as walnuts in the stocking. And then they were fine. We were fine with that. But once in a while, that I would find coal in my stocking.
Oh no. That's so sad. No, the other thing, I didn't get a chance to go into it, which isn't as popular today, at least in America. There is in certain areas, marzipan, almond paste. That was a very popular treat in the early 1900s. So there were mock recipes for making marzipan during this time period. And if you go back far enough, your Christmas ornaments were actually edible treats. Of course, your Christmas tree wasn't as big as our trees today. They would have been like a little bigger than the Nutcracker back there, but tabletop trees. And you didn't decorate till Christmas Eve. And so when the kids would come out, the oranges, the apples, the nuts, the marzipan, candies would all be hanging off the tree. And that was your present with maybe 1 or 2 gifts underneath. And I didn't talk about presents during this talk because there was no way to fit it in, but one of the most enduring, and I don't want to say depressing, but it does just bring you down a peg and realize how rough life was when you read these letters from soldiers fighting to their wives saying, please, please, please make sure my child has a normal Christmas. Do what you can do to not only fill their stomachs, but I know there's rationing on rubber. I know the toys aren't good this year, but there's one letter where the father's like, if you can just get him a football, do that so that when I come home, I can teach him how to play football. So you read these letters and you just like, oh my goodness. I mean, it was sad. It was really sad times. And we can relate to an extent with what we've been going through this year, but, and I'm not going into the realm of COVID. I'm talking about our supply and demand. We're not quite on the level that they were dealing with at that time period.
Yeah. Right.
They did ration toilet paper. Well, they didn't ration, but toilet paper was an issue too during that time period at one point. Perhaps one day we'll have that figured out.
Other questions?
Questions? Comments?
Desi, I just find you mesmerizing. I could just sit and listen to you all day, and I really enjoyed this a lot. And I had some stuff I was going to say, but then you got me all choked up about the letters home, so kind of teared up. But I do remember one story. This kind of shows dysfunction in my family. This is like 4 generations ago. My great-grandparents' family and my grandparents were when my grandparents were kids. And it was a blended family, so there was some us and them going on. And there was, I remember them telling the story of they had both butter and margarine, and my, the eldest stepsister who was kind of running the household, she, on her end of the table with the siblings, half siblings that she liked, she would have butter, and on the far end of the table would be margarine. And apparently, I mean, it was 50 years later and they were still belly aching about that. So apparently it was a very significant thing at the time. It's like you were on the butter end or you were on the margarine end. And I don't know if it was a constant thing or if you could move up and down the table or not, but it was a big deal.
Oh my goodness, that is.
So using rations to, I don't know, to manipulate family members. It's a whole other thing.
Yeah, I don't even know if I'd say that's passive aggressive. I mean, that's open warfare right there.
But it is amazing that it was that significant. Margarine must have been really awful that it was that significant. Also, I think in Southport, I think that people were buffered a little bit with the rationing because we had the Cape Fear and the Atlantic. People could fish, they could supplement. You also read a lot about people hunting, you know, being able to go to Oak Island and or Bald Head, I mean, and hunt. They would, you know, turkeys and birds. Also, we had the wild pigs. So I think some of that was supplemented. And then I believe, I mean, I know we had swamp gardens, Bob, you know, during the Civil War, but there were still swamp gardens. I think I've read that there were gardens in every vacant piece of land in Southport at one point during the war. Like they had a committee that got together and they were like, if anybody has some vacant land, you know, like a little piece of it, and they're not planting it, somebody else will plant in that land so that it was used as much as possible. And I'm pretty sure that was during the World War II era. Yeah. So I think that we benefited a little bit just by locale in Southport.
And I will say this, our rationing here in the States through the war is not the same as the rationing that you see in other countries, let's say Britain. It is regulated by the Office of price administration here in America. If anyone's a Harry Potter fan, they're going to love this. In Britain, it was the Ministry of Food. So kids, whenever I talk about it, they go insane because they're like, what? There are in England ministries just like in Harry Potter? I'm like, well, yes, you got the idea from that, but that aside, at least I get them in. If, you know, it's kind of like talking about natural sponges. You use SpongeBob SquarePants, certain things in history. You talk about Harry Potter and you'll get those kids involved.
The only other thing I wanted to say was because North Carolina had, one of the things I found out when I was researching prohibition and bootlegging in North Carolina, because North Carolina had prohibition so much earlier and so much longer than everybody else, moonshining was still quite common. And one of the ways of making moonshine is to use straight sugar. And so when sugar was being rationed, it was interesting that the moonshiners were still getting it from somewhere. And I know I found an article, a newspaper article at one point where they found a still that had, they could see had used 900 pounds of sugar. And the sheriff was like, where are they getting this? Nobody can get sugar, and they've managed to get 900 pounds in order to make whiskey. And that reminds me, if anybody, if you haven't seen a ration book, we do have one on display in the old jail in our moonshine exhibit. When we do open back up in the case, there's courtesy of Bob Surridge, we have a ration book, and it talks about some of that using the sugar to make moonshine, as opposed to, I think, corn.
So. But Desi, fantastic job.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic job.
It's a little unnerving. I feed off of people, so I prefer talking to a crowd of 100. So it is. I kind of like, it is different. I have to admit, staring at a little dot and talking to it. But I hope I was somewhat clear and concise.
I think you were clear, lots of information, lots of fun. So
oh, thank you.
Great.
Barbara White, thank you.
Okay.
Great job. Excellent.
Hey. Before we leave, I want to mention the two programs coming up later in December. On Saturday, December 12th, the Society is taking part in the city's Winterfest program. And on 1 o'clock on the 12th, we will be showing a video titled "An Old-Fashioned Southport Christmas," Christmas Past. In that video, one of the things you will see is Pat Kirkman is doing a reading of an article by Susie Carson that Susie wrote in the 90s, but the name of the article is "A Southport Christmas During the Great Depression," and a lot of parallels with what Desiree was talking about today. So I think you want to put that down in your calendar, and we'll be reminding you as we go along. And the other virtual event we have planned for December is on the 21st, on Monday the 21st at 7 o'clock in the evening. Mike Royal will be giving telling one of his Southport stories. So you want to join that, and that's going to be a Christmas wish from Mike to all of us.